Human rights abuses have been on the rise in some parts of the world, particularly in developing countries, which include Nigeria. Human rights organizations allege that the use of brute force, child soldiers, unlawful detentions and arbitrary killings are rampant in the country.
You are concerned about this trend. The United Nations highest human rights body, the Human Rights Council, says it will probe Nigeria over allegations of human rights abuses. Now, this is part of the organization's Universal Periodic Review, which aims to improve human rights situation for people the world over. The review sessions take place for 2 weeks, 3 times a year, and 14 countries are reviewed in each of these sessions. On Monday, the Council began reviewing the track records of Nigeria and 13 other countries. How will Nigeria fare at the end of this review? That's the big question everyone is looking at right now. And we have joining us in the studio a lawyer, Ahmed Abbas. Joining us. It's good to see you. Join us, really. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Good.
And we also have a public affairs commentator, Achike Chude. Good morning, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Good to see you all.
Okay, so the question we just asked there, how will Nigeria fare with the eventual outcome of this report by this organization? There's a UN probe, actually, of Nigeria's human rights performance so far. But Ahmed Abbas, I mean, you're a lawyer, and you've been talking over and over again about human rights concerns in Nigeria.
I do not think Nigeria will fare any better than it has always done in the time past, because the culture of impunity in this country is so high. I am a stakeholder, and by virtue of our profession, we interface with most of the institutions that has to do with human rights, security agencies, and all the rest of them. And believe me honestly, I'm not too encouraged with what we see. Let me just tell you a true-to-life story. A family just called me 2 days ago that the young man was arrested in 2016. Someone raped in their community. The police went in search of the rapist, was not found, and they decided to arrest one of his closest allies. The young man has been in medium security prison since 2016. Now,
an ally?
Yes, an ally, a friend. That the only offense he has committed
is being a friend.
A friend to a rapist. I'm not for lawlessness and all the rest of them, but the young man has been in detention now since 2016. You see, when you dehumanize Nigerians, you can't build a patriotic citizenry. When the institutions that ought to be protectors are also brutalizing, dehumanizing, you breed citizenry that do not have faith in the system. I can't understand in a civilized society why a young man should spend how many years now, 2 years down the line, for being a friend of a criminal. That means there's something virtually wrong. Virtually wrong.
And that is just one case.
Just one case.
Yeah, one case out of so
one.
many. Now, Chike, let me bring you in here. Nigeria, really, if you check the records for the past decades, Nigeria has not necessarily fared well over the decades when it comes to human rights record. But where we are right now, does it seem like the government is concerned about some of these reports from international organizations, whether it is Transparency International or Amnesty International or the United Nations Human Rights Commission and all of that?
Well, if Nigeria were interested, really, and wanted to do something about that, something would have been done. We would not have come under the focus of the United Nations at this particular point in time. So that gives you an idea that there is a signal we are sending out to the international community about this state of human rights violations in the country. That's one. And this report is coming against the backdrop of the one by the United States on the security in the country.
Yes.
Okay, the United States Institute of Peace.
The United States government.
Okay, okay.
And their security assessment of the country,
yes.
and again the issue of human rights violation, gross human rights violation,
especially the one before
featured prominently
before President Buhari visited with Donald Trump.
Exactly. And so we can take this thing at 2 levels. One is the official level, taking it from officialdom. The one that is directly linked to the activities of the government. So that would also involve government institutions and agencies under, I mean, normal circumstances, especially the army, for instance. You know, and then the refusal of the government to obey validly given court orders also signals, you know, a serious danger for our democracy, for our country. The fact that even, you know, institutions of states, like the DSS, for instance, goes beyond their duties. You know, it goes beyond their duties from time to time to incarcerate Nigerians against their will without bringing them before the court. The issue of the journalist from Rivers State who spent 2 years in detention without, you know, being brought before the court is an incident that comes to mind easily. And it is happening in virtually every part of this country. Then you come down to the general civil society, some of the things he talks about, you know, police that more or less interfaces with the civilians much more than any other organization, the kinds of violations we have in those places, the prisons, also the same thing, where you have instances where all kinds of people are put in with hardened criminals, people who commit offenses such as crossing, you know, the main roads and all of that.
What
and
you
then
might want to call
you have
minor
the situation, the situation of overcrowding, putting in, you know, inmates, having people who, with those who have serious infectious diseases like tuberculosis and so on within the same small confine and all of those things. So when you look at, and then there's so many, because my organization, the Justice Development and Peace Center, for instance, has in the past 3 years, we've been able to release about 3,000 inmates, over 3,000 inmates from the various prisons, especially within the Lagos metropolis alone. Some of them have very small, committed very small offenses that should not, you know, put, you know, ensure that they are put in detention or in prison and the rest. So some have fines as little as 2,000 naira, 3,000 naira, 4,000 naira. They are there for the next 3-4 years. And also these are the kind of things we see. You know, apart from, you know, like we said, the unsanitary situation, you know, under which, you know, people are kept. The fact that soldiers, for instance, you know, in the guise of the war against, you know, the terrorists and so on, commit all kinds of violation of, you know, human rights.
Let's bring this
so
to,
many other things
yes,
that you're going to talk
Mr.
about.
Abbas. This UN probe seems to be an indictment on the federal government's failure or inability to actually get closure, you know, in so many cases of human rights abuse that have happened over the years. But the report seems to focus a whole lot more on the issue of the military and the security forces handling, especially in the war against Boko Haram in the northeast. And some groups have been saying that this is really just an attempt, you know, to discourage the Nigerian military, you know, from properly executing this war against Boko Haram.
And that's not true, because you see, the security forces are the #1 public service, because they interface, especially the police, for example, they interface more with the public than any other governmental institution. So they relate with us on a day-to-day basis, and they need to be tutored. Because one of the things in my interface with some of these security agencies, the police and all the rest of that, sometimes you meet some officers. I say this with tremendous sense of responsibility. They are wonderful officers. I still saw the area commander, gentleman to the core, doing professional assignment. But sometimes you interface with some of the officers and you want to ask yourself, does this one know what it means to be a police officer? I'm telling you honestly. It's not about that it's a deliberate attempt to discourage them. No. We must hold each other accountable, because if you trace the history of human rights, this is a 1,000-year struggle in societies to have a moral code that will guide governments, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. There are standard procedures. It was a search, because what is right shouldn't be what a leader in Nigeria thinks is right. It should cut across board. That was why that moral code called human right. It was a search for what we hold humanity accountable for dealing with people, because just because they are human beings, that they must be given some measure of respect and dignity.
In spite of the fact that they might be criminals or terrorists,
yes,
and non-state actors.
No. See, that's why there are rules and procedure. You can't. No, one single person, the police officer can't just arrest somebody and say you are a criminal. That's why we have the court there. Because if you allow one single person to determine who is a criminal and who is not a criminal in the society, believe me honestly,
we all may be criminals.
All of us are criminals. So that's why it's a moral code guiding the society on how to run a decent society. You arrest a man, oh, fine and good. You said he has committed an offense. The law says bring him before a court. Tell the court why you think he's a criminal. Bring the facts. And the man also has the right to tell the court his own side of the story. And the court determines who is guilty or not guilty and things like that. If we do not subscribe to the rule of law, you have an animal kingdom. That's the society. That's the reality. You have an animal kingdom. So what we need is that it's not a question. Look, except most times I don't like being I'm not a diplomat. The reality is that, see, the society is structured in such a way that it is the vulnerable segment of the society that are victims of all these abuses. Because the structure is that it protects the elite. They do not know what you are talking about. Go to the prison and look at the class of people. Sometimes somebody is spending 5 years in detention because they ask him to pay 2,000 naira. He can't pay, either for bribe or something like that.
Well, a few of the elites too have been at the receiving end. I mean, you have
they always know how to find their way. Well, the vast majority of people are victims of human rights abuse.
Yeah. Let me bring Achike in here. This report, this is not going to be the first time. Like two of you said that the outcome may not be, in as much as we may not necessarily preempt what they want to do, but the outcome may not be too different, because if you look at the antecedents of what's going on now, from Dasuki to Zakzaki to what the journalists and to others, as the case may be, the report might still be the same. But if the report comes out, whether it is like before or it is better, what are the implications of reports, the outcome of reports like this? Well,
the reality is that human rights issues are exceedingly very, very important, you know, nowadays, unlike what used to happen many, many years ago. Of course, it gets to a level where certain violations of human rights, when they get to a particular degree, then go beyond the concern of the state itself. Now it becomes an international issue. And so you have instances, for instance, where even states, most cases, under the stable of the United Nations Security Council, for instance, can determine that the lives of a particular people are in jeopardy and that other states have a right to intervene. You know, so states are no longer left on their own to decide exactly what constitutes human rights violation and all of that. There are international conventions, you know, all over the world, to which the country, for instance, has bound itself. You know, the 1948 Declaration on Human Rights, Nigeria is a signatory to it. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Nigeria is a signatory to it. Then there are other conventions on, you know, on the protection of the child and all of that. So Nigeria is a signatory to some of these instruments. Some of them have been domesticated, some of them have not been domesticated. But you see, the credibility of a state is sometimes dependent, in most cases, dependent on how the state treats its own citizens. And so if you don't want to be a pariah, we had an instance in the past where Nigeria was a pariah to most of the, you know, international community. And so what that means is that there could be not just political repercussions, but there can also be economic repercussions where sanctions, for instance, can be imposed on the country. You know, so these are some of the consequences of that. And then you cannot sit at table with, you know, the rest of the international community. You are going to be left out of so many other things under normal circumstances that you would have been engaged in because of the dire human rights record that you find yourself in.
So what kind of signal, let me stay with you, Achike, you know, Uchude, what kind of signal do we send out there, especially to the international community, when you hear from a president that, you know, the rule of law, that actually national security should have you know, precedence or preeminence over the rule of law? Yeah. It's a question of course, Abbas should respond to also. Yeah.
No, you see, from the moment, you don't even need to be a lawyer to understand that that statement itself is a misnomer. and that it is patently false and erroneous. There are no two ways about that. Look, the reality is this. The courts recognize, and you see, it is the duty of the courts to protect the larger society at all times. So the courts understand that there are times when a person might contravene the provisions of the law in such a way that the society itself is endangered by the activities of such a person or such people. So what the court does, but again, that decision is not a decision that a president or the executive should take. And that's why somebody made the argument that no man is so good and so wise to be given absolute power. That is the essence of the separation of power. You know? And so what a government does, if a government decides that a person is dangerous to the polity, he approaches the court and gives reason, evidence, why this man's fundamental right, because the rights are fundamental, the right to movement, the right to life, the right to freedom, and so on and so forth, why this man's fundamental rights can be abridged for the sake of public good. And it is on the basis of that that the barrage of criticism that the president, that attended the president's statement, you know, was made manifest. Because, you know, he is not the one to determine. It is not for the executive to determine. It is not for the legislature to determine. It is for the judiciary, it is for the court to say, yes, we agree with you that this man's rights must be abridged. And so on the basis of that, for instance, and I can tell you that the international community is aware, you know, not just of the statement by the president, but the fact that even this statement fits into a stereotype that we're already beginning to see, fits into a pattern. The issue of Dasuki, the issue of El Zakzaki, and the killing of the Shiites, and so many other things that have happened. And that is why they are worried, you know, about the level, the extent to which this country has gone in protecting the rights of the ordinary person. And you just talked about, you know, the war against Boko Haram and the rest. And the reality is this, that yes, in civil society in peacetime, you can talk about human rights law, you know, which we are contending here now. In a war situation, you talk about humanitarian law. It's also an international instrument and gives a guideline for the, you know, behavior of combatants, you know, within a war theater. You do not have a right to bomb civilian targets. You do not have a right to use this, you know, kind of, you know, weapons. Or to even attack certain sites. Incendiary weapon, and to do certain things and so on. It puts, you know, control, a gauge on the conduct of people in a war, in the theater of war, to protect the vulnerable, you know, like he talked about.
All right. Ahmed Abbas, let me come to you on this. The point there is, the way we are now, there are so many institutions that should have been working, you know, together to ensure that we have a smooth system. Not just the National Assembly, not just the executive arm of government, not just the government, judiciary is there, the police, the civil society, and all of that. But one failure or the other, whether it's this judiciary or political party and all of that, have created this room where we have a shortfall in human rights, as the case may be. But from this standpoint, is Nigeria really helpless? Is there nothing? Is it so bad that Nigeria is helpless? Because we've never really had it good when it comes to human rights.
We are not helpless. We are not helpless. The problem is getting the requisite human capital to chair those institutions. Because the problem we have as of today is that the institutions are so weak. Those presiding over them don't even understand why they are there, or even when they understand, somehow, they do not have the deep conviction. I think their personal comfort, their personal security sometimes overrides their desire to do what is right. Most times, I can't say they do not know what to do, but sometimes I think they look too much to the appointing authorities. Yeah, and whenever the body language. Yes, so the body language of the appointing authorities, sometimes they know. Look, all the assassinations in this country, I tell people, if you allow the police, they will unravel it. But most times, I agree. A police officer is trying to unravel a mystery. You transfer him, or you give him order from above. There is nothing mysterious about problems in Nigeria that cannot be resolved. But the greatest challenge is that, as of today, we need courageous men who will put the interests of the nation far above their personal interests. The greatest challenge is that most public officers are too scared because of their comfort, their security. They know what to do, but they are scared that, look, if I decide to do it this way, the governor may not like it, the president may not like it.
I could lose my appointment.
Yeah, I could lose my job. I need my job. Let me just pretend as if I don't know what to do. Most
Okay,
times
so
outside the confines of their office, if you interrogate them, they will tell you, we know what to do.
But unfortunately, our hands,
My hands are tied.
Okay, so let's even talk about government's response to some of these allegations. I mean, in all fairness, a judicial commission was set up by the then acting president Yemi Osinbajo, last year to look into the allegations of human rights abuses on the part of the military. And then, of course, on the other hand, there's a Ministry of, a Ministry of Justice actually set up a National Anti-Torture Committee, NCAT. I mean, would you say that these are not attempts on the part of government to actually, sincerely look into these allegations and find closure, especially for victims?
They are trying their best, but I think one of the most formidable bedrock against human rights violation is an empowered citizenry. See, our people are so timid, to the extent that even sometimes when they know they are right, they lack the courage to stand for it. And Nigerians do not want to be inconvenienced. And yes, they don't want to be inconvenienced. Because sometimes these violations...
Isn't that the major thing? Because they don't seem to believe strongly enough. They're not passionate enough to not only stand up for themselves, but to know that, look, when you stand up for yourself, it affects so many other people.
Standing up for the others.
We
remember how the Arab Spring started. Just one person
set himself alight.
And
one person can make a difference. In everywhere we find ourselves, we must stand for what is right. Because each time we are all intimidated as if there's nothing we can do, it's not true.
All right.
Well, like
as we round off, as we round off now, Achike.
I would just say, if you permit me, one a very clear example that ultimately what goes around comes around. Because you find out that even those who violate the rights of other people are themselves victims one way or the other, And I remember the issue with the former Inspector General of Police, Tafa, Balogu. That was a very clear, issue, denied people their rights, locked people up at will whenever he wanted because he was in charge. He was powerful and all of that. And until one day he fell out of favor with the government of the day. And then he himself became a victim. He himself was asking Nigerians to help him that they want to kill him. The same government that he has served, under which he meted out this kind of series of punishments on other people. And I remember when he was being dragged on the floor, by recruits, by low-ranking, policemen, officers, and so on. He was screaming, asking for the enforcement of his fundamental rights. These are rights that he, denied other people. So the reality is that once...
Okay.
All right.
Unfortunately, we have to go. And there's the Administration of Criminal Justice Act 2015. You wonder how effective that has been, are the states signing up to it? So many questions.
So much to talk about. But we have to look at, we have to leave you here now.
To help them out.
Ahmed Abbas, thank you so much for coming on the
Thank you.
program. Thank you. And Achike Chude, thank you very much for coming as well. Thank you. Right.
Thank you.